The Marine Corps did not find its fastest code inside a machine. It found it on a telephone line between two ordinary officers at Camp Elliott. In one room, a civilian read a combat order in English. In the other, another man listened to sounds almost no outsider in the world could understand. No code book changed hands. No machine clicked. No clerk checked a cipher table. Just breath, a voice, a pencil moving across paper. And in about 20 seconds, the message came back clear enough to move Marines before dawn. 20 seconds. The machine the Marines trusted for secure traffic could take half an hour to do the same job. For the first time in months, speed and secrecy were not enemies. That was the part that stunned General Clayton Vogel. But it was not the part that made the code dangerous. The dangerous part was this: even a Navajo man could hear it and still not know what it meant. In the opening months of 1942, American commanders in the Pacific were living with a problem they could not outshout, outrank, or outmachine. Their messages were too slow when they were safe, and too exposed when they were fast. Japanese radio teams had grown skilled at pulling American traffic out of the air. Field codes that looked usable in headquarters could begin collapsing almost as soon as they reached the field. The simple ciphers were quick but vulnerable. The secure devices were safer but punishingly slow. So a commander had to choose: send the order fast and risk handing the enemy the plan, or secure it properly and risk sending it after the moment had already passed. In an amphibious war, that was not an inconvenience. That was a casualty list before the landing began. A beach assault depends on timing. Boats, artillery, aircraft, naval guns, scouts, medics, and supply teams all have to move on a clock that nobody can see. If the enemy reads that clock, the beach is no longer just defended, it is waiting. That was the arithmetic sitting on Clayton Vogel's desk in San Diego. Vogel was not a young officer chasing novelty. He was 59 years old, a Marine shaped by old, hard places: Peking, Haiti, Nicaragua, the Yangtze patrols, the quiet jobs that do not make a man famous, but teach him how fragile an operation becomes when communication fails. By 1942, he was training Marines for the kind of war the United States had not yet fully learned how to fight: island landings across the Pacific. And every one of those landings would depend on messages the Japanese were trying to read. Vogel did not need a clever idea. He needed a door the enemy could not enter. The man who brought him one wore civilian clothes. Philip Johnston was in his early 50s, a Los Angeles civil engineer and a veteran of the First World War. He was also the son of a missionary who had spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation. He had grown up hearing Dene Bazad not as an academic subject, but as a living language around him. That mattered, because Navajo was not simply uncommon to the Japanese. It was a language with no widely available written system, no useful enemy dictionary, and sounds that punished anyone who had not learned them from childhood. Its grammar and tones did not behave like English. Its meanings could shift in ways that made outsiders feel as if the sentence had closed behind them. Johnston had read about Native American signalmen used in army exercises, and the old idea from the First World War came back to life. Choctaw soldiers had already shown that an indigenous language could defeat enemy listeners. But Johnston believed Navajo offered something rarer: not just a language the enemy probably did not know, a language the enemy could not quickly study. He took the idea to the Navy in Los Angeles, and from there it moved to Camp Elliott. The first Marine officer who heard him was not dazzled. Major James Jones had seen enough confident civilians to distrust the next one. A man claiming he could solve the Pacific communications problem by speaking an unwritten language sounded, at first, like another wartime enthusiast with a miracle in his pocket. So Johnston gave him a sample, a few Navajo sentences across a desk. Jones could not place the sounds. He could not even begin to break them into familiar pieces. That did not make it a code. It made it strange. And strange was not enough. Jones gave Johnston 2 weeks. Come back with proof. On February 28, 1942, Vogel watched that proof himself. A telephone line was stretched between 2 offices. Vogel wrote out 6 messages of the type a unit might send under fire. Johnston brought 4 Navajo speakers from Los Angeles. They were not Marines. They were not trained signalmen. They were civilians, pulled together for a morning demonstration. 2 men waited in one room. 2 waited in the other. The test was deliberately plain. English order in. Navajo speech over the wire. English order out. No encryption machine. No written code book. No weeks of training. One of the messages said the enemy was expected to make a tank and dive bomber attack at dawn. The wording that came back was not perfectly literary, but it was operationally right. Enemy tank, dive bomber, expected attack, morning. A commander hearing that would know what to do. The whole exchange took about 20 seconds. That is when the room changed, because Vogel had just seen the shape of a solution. Not a theory, not a memo, not a future procurement plan, a working channel, fast enough for combat, opaque enough to frustrate the enemy, human enough to move without a machine. A locked room made out of sound. On March 6th, Vogel wrote to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Thomas Holcomb. He did not ask for a small curiosity project. He asked for 200 Navajo Marines to be trained as signalmen. He explained the demonstration, the speed, the accuracy, and the reason the language mattered. He also warned that foreign scholars had studied many native languages in the Southwest, but that Navajo, in his judgment, had remained largely closed to outsiders. Whether every detail of that fear was correct mattered less than the instinct beneath it. Vogel wanted a code that had not already been opened on somebody else's desk. Headquarters did not give him 200. They gave him 29. The approval came as an experiment. That word is important. Experiment meant the Corps was not yet betting the Pacific War on the idea. It meant the first Navajo recruits would have to prove not only that the language worked, but that they could become Marines under the same pressure as everyone else. The standards were narrow. A recruit had to qualify for the Marine Corps. He had to speak Navajo. He had to speak English well enough to move military orders in and out of it. That requirement cut deep into a population that had been forced through schooling systems often designed to erase the very language the military now needed. Still, the first group came together from Arizona and New Mexico, including young men from the Tuba City area. Some were barely out of boyhood. They were sent through boot camp first. The Corps did not hand them special treatment before handing them special work. Only after they became Marines did the 29 sit down to build the second wall, because Navajo alone was not enough. If a Navajo speaker outside the program heard a plain sentence, he could understand it. So the Marines needed more than translation. They needed a code inside the language. Military words that did not exist in Navajo had to be built from the world the men knew. A battleship became a whale. A dive bomber became a chicken hawk. An observation plane became an owl. Other terms were shaped the same way. Familiar images turned into military meaning. Then came the alphabet. For spelling proper names and unusual words, they assigned Navajo words to English letters. But they did not use only one word per letter. They created alternates, so an enemy listener could not simply count the same repeated sound and work backward toward English. That was the genius of the system. It was not one lock, it was two. First, a language almost no outsider could enter. Then, inside that language, a second code that even an untrained Navajo listener would not automatically understand. There was another rule that made it harder and more dangerous. The men had to memorize it. A paper code book could be captured. A list could be photographed. A dead Marine could carry a secret in his pocket without meaning to. So the code had to live in the talkers, in memory, under fatigue, under shell fire, with men shouting around them, with radios failing, cables snapping, beaches burning, and officers waiting for words that might decide whether Marines walked forward or died where they lay. The first Navajo Code Talkers landed with Marines at Guadalcanal in August 1942. That is where the experiment began to stop looking like an experiment. Orders that once had to crawl through machinery could now move through a handset in seconds. A unit could ask for naval gunfire, report enemy movement, redirect supplies, or correct an attack without handing the Japanese the plain meaning of the message. Commanders noticed. They noticed fast. By the end of that year, Code Talkers were no longer a clever addition. They were becoming something a Marine unit did not want to land without. The work was not clean. It was not glamorous. A code talker was not useful miles behind the truth. He had to be near the units that needed him. That meant going in with assault waves, sitting with radios under fire, and staying connected to ships, aircraft, artillery, and command posts while everyone else tried to cut those connections. On islands like Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima, the same code crossed the air again and again. The Japanese heard it. They recorded it. They studied it. They tried to break it. They never did. But the code nearly got some of its own men killed. Not because the Japanese understood it, because Americans did not. Imagine being a Marine under stress, already trained to fear enemy voices on the radio, when strange syllables suddenly come through a handset beside you. To some men, it sounded like Japanese. To others, it sounded like nothing they could name. And in combat, what a nervous rifleman cannot name can become a target. More than one code talker had to be protected from the men he was serving. Some units assigned bodyguards, not just to guard the secret, to guard the talker from friendly panic. The locked room had to be defended from both sides. Philip Johnston, the civilian who had carried the idea into the Corps, did not simply disappear after the first test. Too old for ordinary combat service, he asked to come back into uniform anyway. In September 1942, the Marines made him a staff sergeant and used him to help recruit and train more Navajo speakers. The man who had walked into Camp Elliott with an idea became part of the machine that turned that idea into a wartime system. But the men who carried it paid the larger price. They carried a secret nobody could praise in public. They carried a language many of them had been punished for speaking in school, now treated as a weapon the nation could not afford to lose. And they carried the contradiction silently. The country needed their words, but the country would not tell their story. At Iwo Jima, the proof became impossible to ignore. 6 Navajo Code Talkers worked through 2 days of battle and sent more than 800 messages without error. More than 800 clean transmissions in one of the most brutal fights in Marine Corps history. Major Howard Connor, the division signal officer, later gave the plain verdict. Without the Navajos, the island would not have fallen. That is not a decorative compliment. That is a signal officer describing the difference between a connected force and a blinded one. Naval guns could not help if the beach could not speak. Aircraft could not be corrected if the ground could not report. Infantry could not move safely if headquarters did not know where the line had shifted. The talkers did not win islands alone. No one did. But they kept the nervous system alive. After the war, the sharpest confirmation came from the enemy side. Japan's wartime intelligence leadership acknowledged that Japanese codebreakers had managed to read some American Army and Army Air Force traffic. But the Marine Corps' Navajo Code remained outside their reach. They could hear it, they could catch it, they could hold the recording, they could question prisoners. The door still did not open. And one prisoner proved exactly why. Joe Kiyomiya was Navajo, but he was not a Marine code talker. He served in the Army. He was captured when the Philippines fell, survived the Bataan Death March, and spent years as a prisoner of war. When his captors realized he was Navajo, they thought they had found the key. They brought him intercepted Marine transmissions. They ordered him to translate. Kiyomiya listened. The words were from his own language. Horse, owl, chicken hawk. Ordinary sounds shaped from a world he knew. But the military meaning underneath them was locked away from him. He could recognize the language and still not enter the message. To the Japanese, that sounded impossible. So they treated it as refusal. They punished him for not translating a code he had never been taught. That may be the darkest proof of how well the system worked. It did not depend on the enemy lacking a Navajo speaker. It depended on the code being more than Navajo. It was Navajo, rebuilt by Marines, memorized by Marines, and sealed inside operational meaning. A man could know the language of his childhood and still stand outside the room. For 23 years after the war, the room stayed closed to the American public too. The program remained classified because the code was still considered useful. The men went home to reservations, towns, families, and ordinary work. Many said little. Some said nothing at all. The nation celebrated other victories, while this one remained locked behind silence. Only in 1968 was the program declassified. By then, some of the men who had carried those messages were already gone. They had been essential when the war needed them, invisible when the war was explained, and silent while other people wrote the first version of memory. Clayton Vogel did not become the famous name in the story. He left for the South Pacific later in 1942 and spent the rest of the war in commands that drew less attention than the channel he had helped open. He had asked for 200 men and received 29. Those 29 helped build the one code the enemy never entered. It began with a telephone line between 2 offices, a civilian voice, a Marine general listening, 4 Navajo speakers proving that a message could move faster than a machine and stay darker than a cipher. The war had taught the Marines that every order was a risk. The Navajo Code Talkers gave them something rarer than secrecy. They gave them speed the enemy could hear, but could not use. The room was made of sound, and it stayed locked.